The old man sat at the far end of the bar, a ghost in a tailored suit, nursing a single glass of whiskey for 3 hours. Ethan knew the type. Lonely, wealthy, and invisible by choice. He treated him the same as he treated everyone at the Alibi, the worn-down but warm neighborhood tavern he tended 4 nights a week. He offered a quiet nod, kept the water glass full, and polished the scarred mahogany in front of him, a rhythmic, grounding motion that kept the world at bay. Ethan was a single dad, a man running on fumes and the fierce, quiet love for his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie. Most patrons saw the exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin, the faint shadows under his eyes. They saw a man treading water, and their tips were often tinged with a gentle pity he never acknowledged. But this man, with eyes that seemed to see right through the tired bartender to the foundation of the men beneath, he was different. When he finally rose to leave, he placed a hand on a thick, plain white envelope on the bar. "For you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. For the quiet work, before Ethan could protest or even process the words, the man was gone, melting into the city night. Ethan picked up the envelope. It was heavy. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Tucking it under the bar, he waited until the last drunk had been sent home and the chairs were stacked on the tables. Under the dim glow of a single bare bulb, he opened it. His breath caught. Stacks of crisp $100 bills. He counted them twice, his hands shaking. $5,000. It was more money than he'd seen in one place in his entire life. It was new shoes for Sophie. It was the overdue rent paid. It was a month without the gnawing fear in his gut. It was a miracle. But as he stared at the money, a question echoed the old man's words: what was the quiet work? Ethan tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his worn leather jacket, the weight of it both a comfort and a burden. At home, in their small 2-bedroom apartment that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, Sophie was asleep, her small face serene in the moonlight filtering through the window. He crept into her room and watched her breathe, the soft rise and fall of her chest the only anchor he needed. On her bedside table was a drawing she'd made for him, a stick figure with a huge smile labeled Daddy standing next to a smaller one labeled Sophie. They were holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, the phantom limb of grief for his late wife, Sarah, who should have been the third figure in that drawing. This money, it was a chance to build a tiny fortress around what was left of his world. The next day, he put the envelope in a shoebox at the back of his closet, behind a stack of Sarah's old paperbacks. He couldn't bring himself to spend it, not yet. It felt like a test, though he didn't know who the judge was. At work that evening, the bar's owner, Clara, was in her small office, her face illuminated by the cold light of a laptop screen. Clara was sharp, driven, and carried a sadness of her own that she wore like expensive armor. She'd inherited the Alibi from her father a year ago and was fighting to keep it afloat against a tide of debt and her brother's relentless pressure to sell. She saw Ethan as a reliable employee, but also, he suspected, as a symbol of the bar's fading and profitable sentimentality. "Ethan," she called, her voice tight. "Can I see you for a second?" He stepped into the cramped office. Spreadsheets filled the screen, red numbers glowing like wounds. "The numbers for last quarter are not good," she said, not looking at him. "My brother is coming in tomorrow. He's going to push for changes." Her gaze finally met his, and for a second, her professional mask slipped. He saw fear. "Just be on your best behavior. Richard doesn't appreciate character. He only appreciates profit." Ethan simply nodded. "I understand," he knew what she wasn't saying. Richard saw him as a liability, a sad story that didn't sell high-end cocktails. Richard arrived the next evening like a storm front, all expensive cologne and cold, dismissive glances. He was Clara's opposite, slick where she was grounded, cruel where she was reserved. He walked behind the bar, running a finger over a damp spot and sneering. "This place is a relic, Clara. It smells of desperation and cheap beer." His eyes landed on Ethan. "And you're still employing this one? The widower? What is this, a charity?" Clara stiffened. "Richard, that's enough. Ethan is my best bartender." "Your best bartender looks like he's about to fall asleep in the ice bin," Richard retorted, his voice loud enough for the few early patrons to hear. "This is a business. We need to cut the dead weight, sell this dump to the developers who have been calling, and move on." Sentimentality is for fools. He turned his back on Ethan, addressing his sister in a low, vicious tone. He's a walking sob story. He makes the place look pathetic. You need to fire him. Ethan kept polishing a glass, his knuckles white, his jaw tight. He focused on the rhythmic squeak of the cloth, blocking out the venom. He'd endured worse. He'd held his wife's hand as she slipped away. He'd faced down eviction notices and Sophie's heartbroken questions about why mommy wasn't coming home. A rich man's insults were just noise. But he saw the look on Clara's face, the painful conflict between her loyalty to her father's legacy and her brother's brutal pragmatism. She was being squeezed, and he was the pressure point. He stays, Richard, she finally said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. This is my bar, and he stays, Richard laughed, a short, ugly sound. For now. But every dollar this place loses is another nail in its coffin. And he shot Ethan one last look of pure contempt before striding out, leaving a chill in his wake. After Richard left, a heavy silence hung in the air. The regulars pretended not to have heard, sinking deeper into their drinks. Clara stood frozen for a moment before retreating to her office without another word. An hour later, as the evening rush began to build, she emerged, her composure restored, but her eyes were still shadowed. She walked over to Ethan's end of the bar, ostensibly to check the stock of gin, but he knew she needed to be near the quiet solidity of the work. I'm sorry you had to hear that, she said softly, her back to him as she rearranged bottles. My brother, he has all the warmth of a foreclosure notice. Ethan paused his work, turning to face her. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply met her gaze and said, you were brave. The word hung between them, unexpected. She wasn't used to being called brave. Capable, yes. Stubborn, certainly. But brave? A crack appeared in her armor. My father loved this place, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He said it wasn't about the drinks, it was about the stories. A place where people could be themselves for a few hours. Richard thinks that's a weakness. It's a strength, Ethan replied quietly. It's why people come back. He thought of Sarah. She had loved this bar, too. She used to sit right there, at that corner stool, her laughter filling the space around them. My wife used to say this place was a lighthouse, he added, the memory both sweet and painful. Clara looked at the empty stool, then back at him, her expression softening with a dawning understanding. For the first time, she wasn't just looking at her tired bartender, she was seeing a man who had navigated an impossible storm and was still standing, still capable of offering a light to others. The invisible wall between them began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, unspoken connection. The next night, the weight in Ethan's jacket pocket felt heavier than ever. He'd seen Sophie's worn-out sneakers by the door that morning, the soles separating from the fabric. He'd seen the final notice from the electric company on the kitchen counter. The $5,000 in the shoebox was a screaming siren, calling to him to solve his problems, to build that fortress for his daughter. But then he saw Maria. Maria was one of the young waitresses, a college student working to support her family. She was usually bright and bubbly, but for the past week, she'd been a bundle of raw nerves, dropping plates and fighting back tears. That night, Ethan saw her in the back alley on her break, her phone pressed to her ear, her body trembling. He only caught snippets of the conversation, his heart sinking with every word. No more time, the surgery, please, I'll get the money, I just need another week, her voice broke on a sob. He'll hurt my father if I don't, she hung up, slumping against the brick wall, her shoulders shaking with silent, desperate sobs. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that kind of desperation. He recognized the sound of a world closing in. He thought of Sophie, safe in her bed. He thought of the smiling sun she had drawn. And he thought of the quiet work. What good was a fortress if you built it on an island, ignoring the people drowning right beside you? He walked back inside, his mind made up. The conflict that had been raging inside him for days was suddenly over, replaced by a strange, quiet certainty. He went to the staff locker room, took the envelope from his jacket, and stared at the stacks of cash. It was a lifeline. His lifeline. But as he looked at it, he saw Sarah's face, her compassionate eyes. She had been a nurse, and she had spent her life tending to others. Kindness is the only currency that matters, she used to tell him. The decision was no longer a decision at all. It was an echo of the woman he had loved. Ethan found Maria in the dry storage room, restocking napkins, her face pale and tear-streaked. He closed the door quietly behind him. She flinched, expecting a reprimand for her earlier breakdown. He didn't say a word. He simply held out the thick white envelope. Her eyes widened, confused. What is this?" she stammered. "Take it," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "For your mother's surgery. For whatever trouble you're in. Don't ask any questions, and don't tell anyone where you got it. Just take care of your family." He pressed the envelope into her trembling hands. She looked from the envelope to his face, comprehension and disbelief warring in her eyes. "But, this is—" "I can't." "Yes, you can," he said firmly, but gently. "Someone did something kind for me. I'm just passing it on." The first genuine sob of relief racked her body. She clutched the envelope to her chest as if it were a holy relic, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "God, thank you." From her office, Clara watched the storeroom door close. A moment later, she saw Ethan emerge, his shoulders seeming lighter, his face calm. Then Maria came out, her expression transformed. The frantic terror was gone, replaced by a dazed, tearful hope. Clara had seen Ethan hand her something, a thick envelope. She frowned, confused. Was he paying her for something? Lending her money? The amount of cash that had to be in an envelope that thick, it didn't add up. Ethan could barely afford his own rent. A seed of suspicion, planted by her brother's ugly words, tried to take root. But then she looked at Ethan, back behind the bar, polishing a glass with that same steady, rhythmic motion. She saw the quiet integrity in the set of his jaw, and the suspicion withered. It wasn't a transaction. It was something else entirely. Something she didn't yet understand. 2 days later, Richard returned, and this time he was not just making threats. He strode into the alibi in the middle of a busy Friday night shift, a smug, predatory smile on his face. He was flanked by a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. "Clara." "Good news," he announced, his voice booming across the bar. "I've found our buyer. A very generous offer. We signed tonight, and this sad chapter is over." Clara came out of her office, her face ashen. "Richard, I told you, I'm not selling." "You don't have a choice," he sneered. "I've called a vote with the other partners. You're outvoted. It's over." His gaze swept the room and landed on Ethan. The smile on his face widened. "But before we sign, there's a small matter of housekeeping. A little morality play." He clapped his hands together, demanding attention. The chatter in the bar died down. "It has come to my attention," Richard began, projecting his voice like a stage actor, "that our bartender here, Ethan, recently came into a significant sum of money. A $5,000 tip, or so the story goes. A miracle for our resident charity case." Ethan froze, the glass in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. He felt every eye in the room turn to him. "I'm a big believer in character," Richard continued, circling the bar like a shark. "And I'm curious. What does a man like this do with such a windfall? Does he pay his debts? Fix his sad little life? Or does it just disappear?" He stopped directly in front of Ethan. "So, tell us all, Ethan. Where is the money? Prove to us you're the saint everyone seems to think you are. Show us what you did with it." The room was dead silent. It was a public execution. Richard was trying to humiliate him, to expose him as a fraud or a fool, and in doing so, justify his own cruelty. Clara looked horrified, caught between defending Ethan and the crushing reality of her brother's power play. All eyes were on Ethan. He could feel the weight of their curiosity, their pity, their judgment. Richard's smirk was triumphant. He had backed Ethan into a corner. If Ethan admitted he'd given the money away, Richard would paint him as an irresponsible fool who couldn't manage his own life, let alone his finances. If he lied or refused to answer, he'd look guilty. Ethan set the glass down with a soft click. He looked at Richard, his expression unreadable. "It's a private matter," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. Richard laughed. "A private matter? Of course. The money's gone, isn't it? Spent on God knows what. You see, Clara. This is the man you're defending. No foresight, no responsibility." He turned to the patrons. This is why this place is failing. It's run on foolish sentiment. Just as Richard was about to deliver another verbal blow, a small voice cut through the tension. "Stop it," it was Maria. She stepped forward from the service station, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "You leave him alone," Richard scoffed. "And who are you?" "My name is Maria," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "And you want to know where the money went?" She took a deep, shaky breath, her gaze finding Ethan's. He gave her the slightest shake of his head, not wanting her to expose her family's private pain, but she ignored it. Her loyalty was a force of nature. "It went to my mother," she announced to the silent room. "She needed an emergency heart surgery we couldn't afford. We were in trouble, the kind of trouble you know nothing about. And Ethan, he gave it all to me. He saved her life." A collective gasp went through the bar. The patrons stared, first at Maria, then at Ethan, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Richard was momentarily speechless, his smug narrative completely shattered. At that exact moment, the front door of the Alibi swung open. The old man in the tailored suit, the one who had left the envelope, stood in the doorway. He was not alone. A younger woman with a tablet stood beside him, and two large, imposing men stood just behind. The entire room turned to stare. The old man's eyes scanned the scene, landing on Ethan, then Richard, then Maria. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. "It seems," he said, his voice calm and powerful, "that I've arrived just in time." The old man walked into the center of the room, his presence commanding absolute silence. Richard, flustered and exposed, stammered, Who are you?" "This is a private establishment." The man ignored him completely, his focus entirely on Ethan. "My name is Samuel Harrison," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "And I am not just a random customer." He paused, letting the weight of his introduction settle. The name was familiar to some. Harrison was a reclusive philanthropist, the head of a massive foundation. "Years ago," Samuel continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Ethan, "my wife was dying. She was in the care of a young nurse who showed her a level of compassion and grace that I have never forgotten. This nurse would stay after a shift to read to my wife, to hold her hand, to talk to her not as a patient, but as a person. She made my wife's last days peaceful. That nurse's name was Sarah." Ethan's breath hitched. He felt Clara's hand find his arm, her grip firm and supportive. "After Sarah passed away," Samuel went on, "I tried to find her family, to honor her memory. It took me years. When I finally found you, Ethan, I didn't want to just write a check. I wanted to see if her spirit, her legacy of quiet kindness, lived on. The $5,000, it was a test. A test you have passed in a way I could never have imagined." He then turned to Maria. "My foundation will be covering all of your mother's medical expenses, and we will ensure your family is free from any outstanding predatory debts." Maria broke down in tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Finally, Samuel Harrison turned his piercing gaze on Richard, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "And as for this establishment," he said, his voice turning to steel, "my foundation is prepared to make a significant investment to clear all its debts and fund a full renovation. On one condition." He looked from Richard to Clara. "That the Alibi remains a place of community, a lighthouse, as Sarah called it. And that its management remains in the hands of people who understand its true value." He looked pointedly at Clara, then at Ethan. "Co-managed, perhaps." Richard's face was a mask of utter humiliation and defeat. He had lost. Not just the bar, but the moral argument, in the most public way imaginable. In the weeks that followed, the Alibi underwent a transformation. The renovations were extensive but careful, preserving the soul of the place. The scarred mahogany bar was refinished to a warm gleam, the worn-out stools were reupholstered in rich leather, and the lighting was softened, but the layout, the history, the feeling of it remained. A small, tasteful brass plaque was installed near the entrance. It read, "In memory of Sarah, who taught us that kindness is the only currency that matters." Samuel Harrison's investment had saved the bar, but it was Ethan's character that had redeemed it. Richard was gone, having sold his minority share to the foundation at a price that felt more like a severance package than a windfall. Clara was no longer just the owner, she was a partner, a collaborator. The stress had melted from her face, replaced by a quiet, confident joy. She and Ethan now ran the Alibi together, their partnership seamless, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a slowly blossoming affection that was plain for everyone to see. One sunny afternoon, before the evening rush, Ethan was behind the bar, stocking glasses. Clara was going over invoices in what was now their shared office. Sophie sat at her favorite corner stool, the one that used to be her mother's, coloring in her drawing book. She had brand new sneakers, and her smile was as bright as the sun she was drawing. Ethan looked over at her, his heart full. The gnawing fear was gone, replaced by a deep, settled peace. Clara came out of the office and stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She looked at Sophie, then at the plaque, then at him. "She would be so proud of you, Ethan," she said softly. He turned to her, and the space between them was no longer filled with unspoken grief or professional distance, but with the warm, promising glow of a new beginning. He looked at the empty stool where Sarah used to sit, not with a sense of loss, but with a feeling of profound gratitude. Her quiet work had echoed through the years, saving a young woman, saving a community hub, and building a new family from the broken pieces of the old. He took Clara's hand, their fingers lacing together naturally, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly home. The biting November wind whipped around the corner, rattling the thin glass of the bus shelter. Finn pulled the worn collar of his jacket tighter, tucking his daughter Rosie's small, gloved hand deeper into his pocket. Her warmth was a small anchor against the city's indifferent chill. He watched her breath fog in the air, a fleeting cloud of life. They had a ritual, a silent game of counting red cars to pass the time until the lumbering school bus arrived. Rosie was on 7, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was then that Finn noticed the other child. A little girl, no older than Rosie, stood alone at the far end of the shelter. Her pink coat was pristine, a stark contrast to Rosie's hand-me-down navy one, but her face was crumpled in misery. Silent tears tracked clean paths down her rosy cheeks, her tiny shoulders shaking with unheard sobs. There was no parent, no guardian in sight. A cold knot of parental dread tightened in Finn's stomach. He looked at Rosie, who had stopped counting cars and was now watching the girl with wide, concerned eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice muffled by her scarf. She said, he knew he couldn't just stand there. He approached the little girl slowly, kneeling to her level so he wouldn't seem like a looming threat. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you okay? Are you waiting for the bus?" The girl flinched, hugging a small, sequined backpack to her chest. She nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. I lost my mitten," she hiccuped, holding up one bare hand, red from the cold. "And Mommy had to go to a meeting. She said Nana would be here, but she's not." Finn's heart ached. He glanced around, but the street was empty save for the passing traffic. He gently unwound the gray, woolen scarf from his own neck. It wasn't much, but it was warm. "Here," he said, looping it loosely around her neck. "This will help." He then looked at Rosie, who understood immediately. She dug into her lunchbox and pulled out the oatmeal cookie they'd baked last night, the one she'd been saving. She held it out to the girl. "It has sprinkles," Rosie offered, a solemn gift of the highest value. The little girl's crying subsided into sniffles. She took the cookie with her gloved hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Just then, her bus pulled up to the curb. She looked at Finn, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the cookie and the borrowed scarf. She climbed the steps, and as the bus pulled away, she pressed her face to the window, watching them until they were out of sight. Finn stood up, the wind now cutting straight through his thin jacket, and took Rosie's hand again. He had no idea that this small, simple act of kindness had just sent a ripple through a world he couldn't even imagine. He was just a father, keeping his daughter warm, and for a moment, someone else's too. The fluorescent lights of the corporate lobby cafe hummed a monotonous tune, a sound that had become the backdrop to Finn's life. He moved with an economy of motion honed by years of practice, grinding beans, steaming milk, wiping down the perpetually sticky counter. He was a ghost in this grand glass tower, a functional part of the building's machinery that people looked through, not at. His manager, Garrett, a man whose ambition was as sharp and unpleasant as his cheap cologne, strolled past. "Pick up the pace, Finn," he snapped, not breaking stride. "The morning rush isn't going to serve itself." Finn just nodded, his jaw tight. Garrett enjoyed these small assertions of power, especially when Finn was at his most vulnerable. Today was one of those days. The rent was due Friday, and after paying for Rosie's field trip and a new pair of winter boots that didn't pinch her toes, the numbers weren't adding up. The exhaustion was a physical weight on his shoulders, pressing him down. He glanced at his reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine, tired eyes, a faint line of worry etched between his brows, the frayed cuffs of a shirt he'd mended twice. This wasn't the life he had envisioned. Before, there was laughter that filled their small apartment, the scent of his wife's painting supplies, the shared dream of opening their own little bookstore cafe. But grief was a thief that took more than just a person, it took the future, too. Now, it was just him and Rosie against the world, and his world had shrunk to the four corners of this coffee counter. He served a young woman in a sharp suit, her phone pressed to her ear as she barked orders about mergers and acquisitions. She didn't make eye contact, simply swiped her card and walked away, leaving her change in the tip jar. Finn swept the coins into the jar without looking. Every cent mattered, but the invisibility stung more than the poverty. He was just the coffee guy, the single dad people pitted with a sad smile before turning back to their own important lives. He thought of the little girl at the bus stop, her expensive coat and her profound loneliness. He hoped she was warm. He hoped someone had found her other mitten. It was a small, fleeting thought, a moment of human connection in a day that felt increasingly disconnected and overwhelming. Isabella Vance commanded the boardroom with an icy precision that left her executives both terrified and in awe. She dissected quarterly reports, her gaze sharp enough to find the single misplaced decimal point in a sea of figures. She was the CEO of Vance Industries, a titan of the tech world, and she had clawed her way to the top with relentless determination. But beneath the steel and glass exterior, a frantic, guilty heart was beating. Her phone vibrated on the polished mahogany table, a restricted number. Her nanny. She ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. Excusing herself with a clipped apology, she stepped into the hallway, the city skyline sprawling behind her through a floor-to-ceiling window. "What is it, Maria?" she asked, her voice tight with impatience. "I'm in a meeting," Maria's voice was flustered. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vance, but it's about Amelia. There was a mix-up with my mother. She was supposed to meet her at the bus stop, but her car broke down. Amelia was alone for almost 10 minutes. Isabella's blood ran cold. 10 minutes. An eternity for a 7-year-old. Is she all right? Where is she now? She's fine, she's with me now. The school called me when she arrived. But she was very upset when she got on the bus. She said she lost her new mitten and a very kind man gave her his scarf. And his little girl gave her a cookie." Isabella leaned against the cool glass, her professional composure fracturing. A stranger. A strange man had approached her daughter. Her mind raced with every terrifying possibility. Yet, Amelia wasn't hurt. She was comforted. "A man," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me everything." Maria recounted the story as Amelia had told it, a quiet man with a kind voice, a little girl with a shared cookie, a worn gray scarf now tucked safely in Amelia's backpack. It was a story of simple decency, but in Isabella's world, nothing was ever that simple. She ended the call, her mind no longer on profit margins or market shares. The image of her daughter, alone and crying on a cold street corner, was a physical blow. She had built an empire to give Amelia everything, yet she couldn't even ensure she had someone to meet her at the bus stop. The guilt was suffocating. She had to find this man. Not just to thank him, but to see him for herself, to understand the person who had shown her daughter a kindness she herself had been too busy to provide. Driven by an uncharacteristic impulse she couldn't quite name, gratitude mixed with a healthy dose of suspicion, Isabella bypassed her private elevator and headed for the main lobby. Maria was meeting her there with Amelia, who had an afternoon appointment with the orthodontist. As she swept through the gleaming marble expanse, her eyes scanned the faces of the people rushing by. She had a vague description, a quiet man with a daughter. It was laughably insufficient. The lobby cafe, a place she usually sent her assistant to, was bustling. She stepped up to the counter, her mind elsewhere, ready to place her usual order for black coffee, strong and uncomplicated. "What can I get for you?" The voice was low and steady. She looked up, and for a second, the world tilted. It was him. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. He looked tired, the skin under his eyes shadowed with fatigue, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place amidst the frantic energy of the lobby. Before she could speak, a small voice piped up from beside her. "Mommy, look." Amelia, having just arrived with Maria, was pointing a small finger. "It's him. The man from the bus stop. That's the daddy, and he has a little girl just like me." Finn froze, the portafilter halfway to the machine. He looked from the impossibly elegant woman in front of him to the little girl with the familiar pink coat. The girl from the bus stop. His face flushed, a wave of anxiety washing over him. Had he done something wrong? Was she here to complain? He felt the weight of a dozen critical eyes on him. Isabella's gaze sharpened, taking in his worn uniform, the faint coffee stain on his sleeve. This was him. Just a man serving coffee. "You," she said, her voice more abrupt than she intended. "My daughter. Amelia, she told me what you did this morning." Finn swallowed, placing the portafilter down with a soft click. "She was upset," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I just wanted to make sure she was okay." Isabella reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her wallet, and slid $100 bill across the counter. "Thank you for your kindness." It felt transactional, cold, the only way she knew how to operate. Finn looked at the bill, then back at her. A flicker of something, pride, maybe hurt, crossed his face. "That's not necessary," he said, gently pushing it back toward her. "I'm glad she's all right." No charge for the coffee. He turned to serve the next customer, leaving Isabella standing there, the crisp bill a barrier between their two worlds, feeling strangely and completely dismissed. It became a new, unspoken routine. Each morning, Isabella found an excuse to go down to the lobby cafe herself. She told herself it was about efficiency, about wanting to stretch her legs, but she knew it was a lie. She was drawn to the quiet barista who had refused her money. She started observing him. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and work-worn, were gentle as he handed a hot chocolate to a child. She saw the patient smile he gave an elderly man who took 5 minutes to count out his change. He treated everyone with the same steady, unassuming respect, whether they were a janitor or a vice president. He was a constant in the chaotic swirl of her corporate world. One afternoon, she saw a little girl with a navy coat and bright pigtails run up to the counter. "Daddy, I got a star on my spelling test." The girl, Rosie, beamed, holding up a paper. Finn's entire demeanor changed. The fatigue lifted from his eyes, replaced by a light so pure and proud it momentarily stunned Isabella. He crouched down, ignoring the line of impatient customers, and examined the paper as if it were the most important document in the world. "That's my brilliant girl," he murmured, his voice thick with love. Isabella felt a pang in her chest, a hollow ache of something she was missing. She had video calls with Amelia scheduled between meetings, but this raw, present connection was a foreign language to her. She started to linger, ordering a second coffee she didn't need, just to exchange a few words with him. She learned his name was Finn. He learned hers, though he already knew it from the nameplate on her office tower. She discovered he was a widower, that Rosie was his whole world. He learned, through carefully worded phrases, that her ex-husband was more interested in his new life in another country than in his own daughter. They were both single parents, navigating a lonely, demanding path, albeit from opposite ends of the social spectrum. The sterile lobby cafe began to feel like a small island of warmth in her cold, structured life. But she wasn't the only one who noticed. Garrett, the manager, watched the CEO's daily visits with a toxic mix of jealousy and suspicion, his thin lips curling into a sneer every time Isabella smiled at his subordinate. Garrett's resentment festered. He saw Finn not as a person, but as an obstacle, a nobody who had somehow captured the attention of the most powerful woman in the building. He couldn't comprehend that it was Finn's character, not some hidden agenda, that drew her in. In Garrett's world, everyone had an angle. He decided it was time to remove the anomaly. The opportunity came on a busy Tuesday. The cafe was understaffed, the morning rush was relentless, and Finn was working a double shift, his movements strained with exhaustion. Garrett waited until the peak of the chaos, then made his move. He deliberately shortchanged a customer he knew was notoriously difficult, pocketing the difference himself when no one was looking. An hour later, as the rush subsided, he called Finn over to the register. "We have a problem," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false concern. He gestured to the till. "The drawer is short. $50 short. And I just had a customer call to complain that he was given the wrong change." By you. Finn's blood ran cold. What? That's impossible. I'm always careful. He knew he was. He had to be. Every dollar was accounted for, both at work and at home. Is that so? Garrett's voice rose, attracting the attention of the remaining customers and staff. Because it seems to me that a single dad, struggling to make ends meet, might find himself in a desperate situation. It's a classic story. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Humiliation washed over Finn in a hot wave. He saw the whispers, the sideways glances from his co-workers. His integrity was all he had left, the one thing he was determined to model for Rosie. And here, in this place he hated but desperately needed, it was being stripped away from him in public. I didn't take anything, Finn said, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. You can check the cameras. Garrett smirked, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eye. Oh, I will. But by the time I get around to it, you'll be long gone. I'm calling security. You're fired, Finn. For theft. He spat the word out, savoring the impact. Finn felt the floor drop out from under him. Fired. For theft. How would he pay the rent? How would he explain this to Rosie, who was due to meet him in less than an hour, her spelling test still proudly taped to their refrigerator at home? He felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. Just as Garrett reached for the phone to call security, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. What, exactly, is going on here? Isabella Vance stood at the entrance of the cafe, her briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable. Every head turned. Garrett's sneer was instantly replaced by a sycophantic smile. Ms. Vance. Just a small internal matter. This employee, he said, gesturing dismissively at Finn, has been caught stealing from the register. I was just handling it. Isabella's gaze moved from Garrett's smug face to Finn's. He was pale, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, but his eyes met hers directly. There was no deceit in them, only a deep, desperate hurt and a fierce, quiet dignity. She saw Rosie standing hesitantly near the lobby entrance, her small face clouded with confusion and fear, clutching her backpack. This was the man who had wrapped his own scarf around her daughter's neck. This was the father who treasured a spelling test like a stock certificate. The pieces didn't fit. He's a thief, Ms. Vance, Garrett pressed on, sensing a moment of hesitation. You can't trust people like him. They see an opportunity, a person like you paying attention to them, and they take advantage. It was a moral crossroads for Isabella. Every business instinct she had honed told her to trust the system, to believe her manager, to cut the liability. Her world was built on verifiable data and calculated risks. But her heart, a part of her she had long suppressed in the boardroom, was telling her something different. It was remembering a little girl's tear-streaked face,